We're delighted to be hosting today the President's Speaker Series, and certainly we have a renowned guest here, our own Dr. Aaron Tillman. And of course, he will be available for autographs after today's session as well. But certainly it gives us an opportunity today to celebrate Dr. Tillman's accomplishment with his most recent book, Every Single Bone in My Brain. For those of you who don't know Dr. Tillman, you certainly will understand his sense of humor and wit by the end of this event. And I do encourage you to read the book. That'll give you greater insight, certainly to Dr. Tillman's wit and certainly his sense of humor. Dr. Tillman is the Associate Professor of English and Director of the Honors Program here at Newbury College. Dr. Tillman has been here at Newbury since 2010. He teaches courses in the School of Arts and Sciences, as well as in the first year Foundations course, the Liberal Arts HU 100 course. He has published many works already in fiction, and we certainly are delighted to have him here today. He will be sharing his insight and certainly his reading from the books. Without further ado, Dr. Tillman, welcome.
First of all, I want to say thank you so much for being here, for President Chillo for setting this event up. I'm really, thrilled and honored to be here, and really a lot of the stories that were written in this book were written while I was here. Should have been working, but I mean, they were inspired by elements here. I mean, some were written beforehand, and they really sort of span. And what I was thinking of doing today is talking a little bit, just about some experiences, some of what led me to, I'll sort of talk my way up to the beginning of this book, and then I'll read a short story from the book that kind of relates to some things that I'll talk about, and then maybe some questions and answers and things like that. Perhaps if you have tomatoes, you can just throw them, or whatever it may be. But just don't hold back. That's really the key. I guess I'll begin with at a very early age, I had sort of two artistic passions. One was writing, and the other was acting. And I mean, truly, I was actually in a commercial when I was in high school. And as you might imagine, it was for hair extensions. And this is the funny thing about this is that's true. That's a true story. It was a non-speaking role, and I don't think I was the target audience exactly. But now that I think about it, maybe the person I was meant to be with, maybe the point was that if she had hair extensions, she'd have a better date. But I don't want to analyze that too much. But I was in that commercial, and I started getting into acting around that time. So I was in productions in high school and college and beyond. And I remember when I got to college, the very first play that I was in was an experimental play called The Pragmatists. And I had a feature role in this play. It started off, I was lying on this bed of newspapers, I was in torn clothes, I had no shoes, and although I didn't necessarily understand the play very well, there were emotional truths that I was able to sort of latch onto, and I really found the whole experience kind of thrilling. So I remember after our first performance, someone came up to me, and said, "Hey, I was at the play," which I understood because we were still in the theater and stuff like that. And he said, "I just wanted you to know that you have really long toes." I was thinking, okay, that was not the comment I had expected to hear. And although I spoke to a number of other people that day, I couldn't quite shake the long-toed comment. Kind of walked around with it for a few days, and finally I approached one of my more thoughtful friends. And in college I didn't have many thoughtful friends, but I had at least one. It's good to have one. If you have one, that's good. And I asked him, I said, so what'd you think of that play? And he said, well, and then it was followed by this sort of what they call a pregnant pause. It just kind of went on, and eventually said, I found the play kind of confusing, but I like that one moment where things were going pretty bad for you, and it looked like you were kind of angry and frustrated, and I thought you were going to yell, but you didn't. And that was it. That was the comment. Yeah. So, I was like, all right, okay. What's interesting is, although it might have been sort of anticlimactic, that was sort of exactly what I needed to hear at that moment, and I'll explain why. What he did was he isolated and identified a choice that I had made. I remember actually being in rehearsal, and that particular moment trying out different ways to express my frustration and anger. And there were rehearsals where I did yell. And there were others where I stomped around and waved wildly in the air and all those things. But it wasn't until I sort of was compelled to sort of swallow that anger and frustration that it felt right to me, that there was some kind of emotional honesty to it. And I was really grateful that he was able to pick that out. And he also said something that relates to a lot of what I think about when I'm writing and what I try to express to students in my creative writing classes, is that we aim to be surprising and convincing. He thought I was going to yell, and when I didn't, he was satisfied by that. So there was an element of surprise and convince. Now, granted, it wasn't a brilliant moment necessarily, but it was something I sort of took with me, and I had an opportunity while in college to write more, to act more. I ended up going abroad a couple times while I was an undergraduate, something I encourage you to look into, and we're starting to offer more opportunities to go abroad. Went to Ecuador, where I met my wife. She's American, but she was on the same program. And then I also traveled to Vietnam my senior year, where I had an opportunity to do a creative writing independent study. So, and there, when you're writing, this is something I talk to my writing students about a lot, you have what is sometimes called writer's sensitivities. You're aware of things that you might not have been aware of before, things that might be ordinary strike you as somehow extraordinary. And because somewhere in your mind, you know, you're thinking about writing, you might have to capture something. You want to be more observant. And I think traveling does the same thing. I know that traveling does the same thing. Even if you're traveling in your own city, or if you're traveling anywhere, you're experiencing things that are different, and your eyes are open in unique ways. And I think the two kind of came together very nicely for me when I was in Vietnam. So I did a lot of writing when I was there. And I came home, after I graduated, I spent a year living in the Adirondacks in this cabin in the woods and working as a waiter in Lake Placid by day and writing about working as a waiter in Lake Placid by night. And but I was also revising some of these stories that I wrote in Vietnam. I ended up sending them out to various graduate programs, writing programs, and I wound up getting my Master's of Fine Arts in Fiction Writing from Sarah Lawrence College. And they accepted me because of those stories. I don't know, maybe they thought, well, he could do better than that, let's get him in, or whatever it was. But I ended up going there, and the MFA experience was really valuable for me. It really privileges the workshop, the writing workshop, where you get this community that, writing can be very isolating, and all of a sudden you have this community where people are putting forward out, their own material, they're thinking critically about yours. Although, you do get sort of the long-toed comments sometimes, you get a lot of feedback that is very specific, very clear, isolates those moments, lets you know what you're doing well, what's working, and what you might still need to work on. But the value of those workshops was not as much the feedback that I was receiving, but the opportunity to think critically about other people's work. I started to model, not necessarily the writing as much as the critique. I found I was so grateful for some of the critiques that I had received, and I really put a lot of emphasis on my, reading other people's works very carefully, providing clear and thoughtful critique, and that helped me in a lot of ways. And, when I was there, I was also introduced to a lot of different types of literature, which was exciting. So my eyes were being opened in different ways. Some of the literature that I found particularly inspiring were sort of some experimental works. I still was, had the pragmatists in my head, and I wanted to do something different. So a lot of, postmodern works, some of the metafictional and magical realist works that I am writing to some degree right now. Also, some of the more realistic pieces were set in some kind of gritty New York City scene, which I found very exciting living in New York City at the time. But what I found, even though I learned a lot and wrote some things that I'm proud of while I was there, I wasn't necessarily capturing the kind of emotional truth that I wanted to. Some of my conceptual stories about writers, writing about other writers, writing about other writers who then break in and kill someone else, I don't know. It was just, they were sort of fun conceptual stories, but they were sort of cold conceptual stories. And my stories about sort of this gritty New York City scene were exciting to write. The only thing was that I didn't really know the gritty New York City scene. I lived in New York for about 4 years, and I knew some scene, but it wasn't the one that I thought I needed to write about. It wasn't my scene exactly. And it wasn't until I left New York City that I sort of started to find my own voice. And in this case, I left left the person who would become my wife, got a job in San Francisco. We decided to move. Or she decided to move. I was following along, which was kind of exciting. But we went together. That's the real point. So remember that. Anyway, and it was a lot of some personal elements, things from my life were sort of coming together at this point. I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania, and we used to travel to New York a few times a year to see plays. That was one thing, and also to see, President Chill, you'll appreciate this, the Yankees. So that was the other piece. So we went a few times a year, and whenever we left New York, riding over the George Washington Bridge, we always got onto Interstate 80. And Interstate 80 took us into Pennsylvania, but if anyone knows that road, it'll take you all the way across the country until you get to the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. So I always had this sort of fantasy that what if we just kept going? That would be kind of cool. And here I was, things were coming around, and my wife and I were going. We were traveling on this road all the way across the country. We had this U-Haul. Everything that we had in our possession at that point was in the back of this truck. My wife and I and our 2 cats were in the front cab, and it was kind of exciting. We had some long days driving, and eventually we got to Nebraska. And if you know Nebraska, it's flat. It is flat and it's straight, and you could do that cool thing where, like, hey, I'm still driving, right? And you're just going because you don't have to touch the wheel, and that's sort of fun, and your mind can wander. But then it gets old eventually, and it gets dark eventually, and the winds start pouring in, and the truck starts moving around, and I'm sort of white knuckling it here, and my cats are prowling around and howling, and my wife is sort of miraculously sleeping. I don't know how that happened, or my future wife, that is. Maybe she wanted to see if I'd make it through, and that was first test. And what had been this sort of inspired, creative, afternoon turned into sort of this paranoid creative evening, and all of I felt sort of my mind start to split, and I just was really like I had my life flashing before my eyes. So I started thinking about elements, whether it was my, how I grew up, what was important to me, what I had done, all these things, and hoping all the while to survive. I don't want to spill anything, but we survived, which was good. And the next day, I think it was the next day, we wound up in Utah's Great Salt Lake Desert, this beautiful stretch. And I just started thinking about all these pieces from leaving New York to riding in Nebraska and having these, fearing my mind kind of splitting, and here in the Great Salt Lake Desert, kind of pieces to a story came together, that was grounded in things that were personal, that had some kind of emotional truth for me, and yet I was able to fictionalize and bring something together. Those pieces became the very first piece that I ever got published, and the first piece that's in this, called The Great Salt Lake Desert. I was thinking about reading that today. It's a little bit too long, so I'm not going to, but I wanted to give you some of that context, some of that background. What I am going to read, and I'll cut there right now, is a story so Great Salt Lake Desert was published in 2002. The story I'm going to read was published in 2016. So this story has, this collection has a number of stories that sort of span time. What's interesting about the story I'm going to read is that it's basically, at least in my mind, set in my hometown in Pennsylvania. So I learned that, one of the places that I knew, a place that could be more unique and exact for me and the readers, was not necessarily some, romanticized scene, the gritty New York city scene that I had appreciated reading about and sort of fantasized about and romanticized in my head, but it was something that I knew, in this case, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. So I don't write too many stories about Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. I know there should be more. You can hear it, right? But this is one of them that I wrote within the last couple of years, and it's a story called High Holy Days. So we were, here we are in the fall. There are, some high holy days. If you, in the Jewish tradition, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are the holiest days, right? I mean, someone can correct me here. I wear my ignorance on my sleeve, even though I was raised. But thanks, Howie. Okay, good. Affirmative head nod. Anyway, so these happen in September and October, typically. You may have had a professor who had to miss a class or had you do some things online for that. So this also relates to something very early, and although this is fiction, I did have to change some names to protect protect the guilty. Anyway, so I'm going to read this story. It again has a sort of a youthful character at the center of it. Has some racy language, so you'll have to forgive that. But it's, again, the emotional honesty I'm aiming for. So really, before I read, I just want to sort of reinforce three things, which is that when I'm writing, and I can't always accomplish this, and one of the things that I communicate to my students is we want to aim for some kind of emotional truth, regardless of what we're writing, where it's set, even if it's set on Mars. There should still be some kind of emotional truth. You want to be as unique and exact as you can be, and if you can, surprising and convincing. And those are sort of the three things that, again, I'm not claiming I could always accomplish them, but emotional truth, unique and exact, and surprising and convincing are statements that anyone who's in my creative writing class this spring, which I encourage you to enroll in, EN 205, you'll hear me say some of those things. So here is the story, High Holy Days. And I'll just kind of launch right in. So, High Holy Days. The moment he started peeing into the synagogue soap dispenser, I knew there was something special about Eli. I had only seen him a few times before. He was the new kid who didn't come to Sunday school, but wasn't afraid to mix in with the rest of us on the handful of occasions when we were forced to come to services. This time, it was Rosh Hashanah, Jewish New Year, and the first of the High Holy Days. I did my usual huffing, sighing routine as I put on my only sport coat and slacks, both as stiff and as rough as our basement floor, and clipped on my polyester tie. The High Holy Days were always a slog, but I knew that after logging the requisite time in the sanctuary, the older kids would start peeling out like leaves of an artichoke and meet up in the synagogue bathroom, the playroom for kids too old for babysitting. I had earned a certain amount of renown for my ability to scale the tile walls of the narrow entryway until I touched the flat white ceiling of the synagogue bathroom. My long legs and rubber bottom topsiders helped me in this effort, but I'm not above admitting to a certain amount of strength and skill. Beyond the wall scaling, we did the usual toilet paper and water fights, soap bubble volcanoes, chapstick drawings on the bathroom mirror, spitball fireworks when we were able to raid the kitchen for straws. These activities kept us entertained until one of the altar cockers from the congregation had to pee, and we would all flee, most of us back to the sanctuary to sit innocently by our parents. Only Eli wanted to stay out in the halls even longer. Only Eli didn't feel the burden to go back. Still a novelty kid with a unique way of squinting, smiling, and talking out of the side of his mouth, Eli had an undeniable allure. I was instantly drawn to his exotic coolness and mischievous potential. When he said, "Let's stay back," even as everyone else was returning to their seats, it was too enticing not to comply. When the old man with the guttural cough and smacking teeth shuffled his way out of the bathroom, Eli nodded toward the door and slipped back inside. Pupils wide with nerves, I followed behind. "You can climb to the ceiling, right?" he said, eliciting an enthusiastic nod from me and an urge to do it on the spot just for him. But Eli moved past the entryway into the bathroom proper, where he started looking around with anxious eyes, as if to identify some untapped source of devilry, something to top the juvenile acts of mischief that had engaged us before. I saw the pinch of his brow when he approached the sink. Without conference or hesitation, he unscrewed the wide bulb of liquid soap, unzipped his fly, and began to pee into the metal mouth, which projected a gasping O at the audacity and indecency of this act. It was the most exciting moment in synagogue history for me. Who would do such a thing? Why hadn't I thought of it? The soap was already urine yellow. Suddenly, scaling the walls of the entryway seemed lame in comparison. JV. "This is nothing," Eli said, after screwing the soap basin back into place. "At our last synagogue, my brother shit in the rabbi's flower pot." And that's exactly how he said it, too. Shit in the rabbi's flower pot. Not take a poop or went number 2 or anything. Shit to me here in the synagogue bathroom. So I did the only thing that I could at this time. I said the only thing I could at this time. Shit, shit, shit. It just stormed out of me. He had opened up the gates, giving me permission to use these forbidden words. Eli stared back, a bit startled at first, and then he smiled that crooked smile. "Fucking shit," he said, and the game had officially changed. When we eventually did return to our seats, my parents eyeing me suspiciously, admonishing me in harsh whispers for being gone so long. "You missed the blowing of the shofar. How could you miss the blowing of the shofar?" Imploring me to sit quietly and pay attention to the rabbi who was droning something about respecting and honoring sacred institutions as we ring in the new year. I slumped in my seat and wondered when I would get to hang out with Eli again. At home that night, my eyes darted from place to place, as Eli's had when he entered the bathroom. I was scanning the rooms of my home, looking for places I might be able to relieve myself. It bummed me out that I didn't have a brother to teach me how to pee or poo somewhere exciting, anywhere different. I vowed that if my parents had any more children, unlikely, they always said whenever I brought it up, I would teach my younger brother or sister how to do unspeakable things to all sorts of household objects. I asked my mom about a play date with Eli, but she hadn't met his parents yet and thought it was best that we wait. So it wasn't until a couple of weeks later, on the eve of Yom Kippur, Kol Nidre, the service inviting all sinners to pray, when I saw Eli again. The rabbi had included a plea in his weekly bulletin that children in 5th grade and beyond, those approaching bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah age, should attend this powerful service, not simply Yom Kippur Day. Most of my Sunday school classmates complied, and I felt a surge of relief when I saw that Eli was also there. He had a small Band-Aid on his chin, was telling anyone who asked that he cut himself shaving. Coming from a 10-year-old boy, Eli's comments elicited hearty laughs from everyone in the congregation. I seemed to be the only one who wondered whether he might be telling the truth. The service hit its natural lull. We started our slow procession out of the sanctuary, meeting up in the boys' bathroom. Eli and I were the only ones who didn't participate in the soap bubble volcanoes. When Marty Schultz started making a soap bubble beard, Eli and I were snickering so hard that Marty assumed he was a comic genius. The other boys fought for the suds to wipe all over their faces too, hoping to match or one-up the response that Marty was getting when one of the altar cockers walked in and everyone scrambled away from the sink, toweling their faces as they fled. Once again, Eli and I stayed back. I followed as he paced the halls between the bathrooms, glancing at the doors, smiling coyly when the old man finally left, and then stopping to huddle in the hallway. "I got an idea," he whispered, looking back and forth to make sure that no one was coming down this hall. "This time," he said, "let's go to the girls' room." My head shot up. My heart started racing. When I didn't respond, he stepped right up to the door and pushed it open with his elbow, peering in with one eye. "All clear," he said, as he led the way inside. It was exactly the same layout as the boys' room. Salmon pink tile walls and no urinals were the only difference. But the fact that I was in a forbidden room made it seem like nothing I'd ever experienced before. Eli's eyes were on everything. We were adventurers with limited time. The bomb was ticking, and we had to do something before it exploded. When we heard a noise outside, Eli ducked, as if shots were coming from an open window. "Grab something," he said, "grab something." Before he could clarify what type of thing he was looking for, he shuffled over to the paper towel dispenser and pulled out 30-odd paper towels and shoved them into the inside pocket of his sport coat. Eli pulled open the door. No one was outside. In the hallway, we were smiling to our ears. He took out the wad of paper towels and gave me half. "Your share," he said, and we both sliced back to the sanctuary, high on our latest triumph. I was hopeful that I'd be able to see Eli again the next day. I was ready to go before my parents had to ask. When we arrived for Yom Kippur services and Eli was nowhere in sight, my whole body deflated. Slumping in the blue cushioned seat, my mother put the back of her hand on my forehead, trying to determine whether I was feverish or just sulking. I was about to insist that I'd contracted some incurable illness when I saw Eli and his mother standing in the back of the sanctuary, scanning the rows for a place to sit. "I'm fine, Mom, I'm fine," I snapped, sitting more upright, anxious for an opportunity to escape. Although it took longer than I could comfortably bear, eventually Marty Schultz and Ethan Nussbaum and the other 5th and 6th graders, including Eli, began filing out of the sanctuary, all of us wearing the same sport jackets and ties we had worn the night before. It was one of the downfalls to encouraging attendance at Kol Nidre. Most of us only had one synagogue suit, but this was the first Yom Kippur I remember being excited. Instead of atoning for my sins, I was anxious to start accumulating things to atone for. When we got to the bathroom, Eli whispered, "Don't tell them about the girls' room yet. I have another idea and I don't want anyone to spoil it." All I could do was nod, floating on the exclusivity and fellowship and all that Eli and I had forged over the course of the High Holy Days. For the first time ever, they finally felt holy to me. Aside from our limited attire, another downfall of the consecutive days at synagogue had to do with our lack of creativity as we huddled in the bathroom. It might have also had something to do with the somber mood of the holiday, or that some of the more serious boys had started to fast already. Whatever it was, likely a combination of all these factors, we mostly just huddled around the sink, occasionally someone turning the faucet on and off. The one effort to instigate a splash fight fizzled out quickly when Marty, of all boys, said he wasn't in the mood and didn't want to get his jacket all wet. Eventually, everyone left the bathroom and Eli pulled on the tail of my coat to keep me behind. "How long can you stay up near the ceiling when you climb up?" he asked me. "You know, in the bathroom." "I don't know," I admitted. "As long as I want, I guess." Then in a surge of cockiness, "I bet I could stay up there for 10 minutes at least." Eli's eyes not only widened, but started to glisten as he urged us closer to the wall, preparing to share his plan in a hushed voice. He wanted me to scale the walls again, only this time in the girls' bathroom. More importantly, he insisted, we had to get evidence. He showed me his small silver camera. He really had planned this out in advance, and said we needed to take pictures for proof. It was something his own brother hadn't even done. It would be set a new level for daring. He used words like epic and legendary and other things I'd never heard, at least in this way, from someone my age. He said it while I was scaling up the ceiling, he'd watch the hall. When the coast was clear, he'd take a picture of me touching the ceiling of the girls' room, then hand over the camera so I can get him in one of the stalls. We'd be the coolest boys in synagogue history. He led the way into the girls' room, and after surveying the space, dipped his head to confirm that the stalls were empty. We stepped back to the narrow entryway. He showed me the camera and told me to head up. "I'll make sure no one's coming," he said. Then, responding to the look on my face, he repeated his call for me to climb. "What if somebody comes?" I asked, finally breaking my silence. "Nobody will," he assured me. "And if somebody does," a direct contradiction to what he had just said, "I'll think of something. Don't worry. I won't leave you hanging, not on Yom Kippur." Then, with a crooked smile, he gestured for me to ascend and said he'd check the halls and be right back. "You should be all the way up when I come in with the camera," he said. "No time to waste." I made my way up, then heard his voice outside, probably telling me to speed it up or something. I was already to the ceiling when the door opened. I was about to scoff, say, "Bet you didn't think I could make it up so fast," when I saw that the hair on the person who entered was more blue than brown and permed in wide curls. It wasn't Eli at all, but Mrs. Szymanski, who waddled into the bathroom. She walked right under my legs and into the nearest stall. I averted my eyes and held my breath, as if breathing in the same air while she went to the bathroom would have added to the sin. By the time she finished and flushed and made her way to the sink, my legs were burning. She pulled her curls at the bathroom mirror, waiting for the faucet to reach a satisfactory temperature, both of us concerned that it never would. Eventually, she started washing her hands, lathering to the cushions of her elbows. I was happy she wasn't washing with the soap from the boys' room. When she finally finished, she reached her hand into the metal paper towel dispenser, but nothing came out. She crouched nearly to the floor to confirm that the bin was empty. I could feel the bulge of towels in my jacket pocket. That's when my foot finally slipped, making a high-pitched squeal against the tile wall. Mrs. Szymanski looked up and gasped just as I fell, landing hard on my shoulder and hip, paper towels spewing from my pocket and fanning the ground before her. She let out another loud gasp, followed by a rapid series of incomplete and amalgamated words. You better no. As she glared down at me, this 10-year-old boy who had fallen from the sky and was now on the floor of the women's room, I pointed weakly toward the paper towel rack and said, "I was going to," when the lights started flashing, sirens blaring. Is this what happened when a boy went in the girls' room? Had security or the rabbi been watching me this whole time? Had Mrs. Szymanski set the siren off? Had God? My mind was reeling with possibilities. Then I realized what it was, the fire alarm. I scrambled to my feet, handed Mrs. Szymanski a paper towel, and hobbled out of the bathroom, my whole left side throbbing. Once in the hallway, I scampered toward the doors and joined the masses who were exiting the synagogue. Everyone had congregated in the parking lot. I found my parents, who looked concerned and suspicious at the same time. I smiled sheepishly and did my best to hide from anyone who looked remotely like Mrs. Szymanski. I scoured the crowd for Eli. The fire department arrived with one truck. The synagogue was searched. Hushed voices discussed what might have occurred. Gas leak, bomb scare, smoke in the kitchen. Before long, the fire crew was back outside, followed by the rabbi, Eli, and his mother. Eli had pulled the alarm and saved me in the process. I never saw Eli again after that. Playdates were out of the question, and Eli and his mother never came back to our synagogue. But I had learned more about Yom Kippur from Eli than I had ever learned before. It wasn't just atoning for the sins you had committed. Sure, that was part of it, but forging a new path as you moved ahead. It was about the future as much as the past. Ever since I can remember, I was told that on Rosh Hashanah, God writes everyone's fate in the book of life and waits until Yom Kippur to finalize the whole thing and seal it all up. When the book was closed at the end of this Yom Kippur, I didn't know what would be written about me or what would be written about Eli. All I knew is that I was a little more alive, a little more free. Eli had liberated me, had made me aware that holiness wasn't only in the sanctuary. It could be found in the most profane places and in the most profane acts. The synagogue bathroom could be a source of inspiration, a temple of liberation and lore. Eli, a fucking god. Thank you very much. Yeah. And I should say a little something about that story. My brother, who doesn't really read much, but did after I asked him to buy my book, and and I knew that he probably wouldn't have read anything. So I said, why don't you check out High Holy Days? I'm just curious to know if he was asking. I think it might have followed a question about did you write about, I think he was worried that I had written about him, which those stories would be far too dark. But but no, he's a good guy. But anyway, I told him to check that story out, and he just texted me back with one name, and he got that name. So it was again, fiction, definitely fiction, but there were some things that sort of stuck with me, and I was grateful that a lot of what allows us to get stories is to sort of ground things that we know well, ground things in circumstances that we are familiar with. So my efforts, certainly when I was in New York and even before, weren't grounded in a place that I was confident I knew. So this time, and in other stories certainly that preceded this, I was able to let my imagination sort of grow from a place that I felt secure with, a place that I could describe, a place that I could bring to life in some way. Not that the synagogue's too vivid in this, but at least the circumstances were fairly real. But so I'm happy to do anything. I've got some dance numbers I was working on. I'm happy to take some questions or whatever anyone would like. I promised Lori some juggling and a unicycle, but I wasn't able to come through. That is Dean Gordy. So yes, Professor Mayo, would you, Debbie?
Read that a writer went into a room and went to the symbols drawer, and took a symbol out from here and a metaphor from there and a simile from there, and then put it all together so that the professor could test us on something. Yeah. And so, and then when I'm thinking about your story, High Holy Days, of course I'm listening to it and enjoying it so much, but I'm also thinking, so there's that means that, so there you go. But that's not what you do.
No, it's a very exclusive drawer. I just got the key. No, it's interesting, and that's something, I'm glad you brought that up. It's something we talk about in creative writing too, that a lot of it, I think the most, meaningful symbols aren't necessarily done consciously and intentionally the first time around. I think things are happening, maybe subconsciously, you're writing, and what happens is you see something get repeated, or, maybe there's a plum in the fruit basket in one scene, and then the plum is mentioned later, and then it wasn't like you were thinking, that's a symbol of the bruised heart or something like that, but all of a sudden you're like, that's interesting that plum gets repeated, and maybe there is some value to that. And good writing is good revision, is careful and comprehensive revision, is going back and again. So revision, to look at something again, is enormously valuable, and I think that process of revision is where you find those symbols, is where you find those things that you say, okay, well, that's interesting. That's something that I didn't even realize was there, and now I can kind of work with it. It can have some meaning. I can bring it up again, and oftentimes when we're developing stories, if you want it, there's a writer, Charles Baxter, that I like a lot. That he spoke when I was actually at Sarah Lawrence when I saw him, and I've read a number of his things, essays and fiction. He said that if you don't know where to go, you should look to the furniture of your story. Look back to your story and see what's there. You know, that dog that's there, that couch. Is there anything that can be used again? And all of a sudden, it not only helps, you know, make those earlier pieces more significant. They're not just dropped in there for no reason. They actually have this purpose, but they can sometimes turn into something more symbolic. And then, of course, there's the famous Chekhov line: if a gun appears in Act 1, by Act 3 it must go off. Hopefully I didn't butcher that. Carlos, you would know. Did I get that right? More or less, yeah. So the idea is that if it's there, it should have some kind of purpose. And I often, there's a lot of writers I think about with that idea, but I think the symbols often work. Now, I'm not that way, at least in my experience, but that's not to say that there aren't writers who know from the beginning that, this spoon is going to be all I need, or maybe there are, like the bird cage, or something like that could be symbolic of something, or a canary or whatever it may be. But but for me, it's always been sort of accidental on purpose. Then I go back and say, okay, now I'm going to work with this thing that I didn't realize was there, and I think that works. And then if not, you just go to the drawer. Yeah, that's the way to work it.
Do you notice any kind of changes in maybe your style of writing, or even growth as a writer from some of your earlier stories till now?
Yeah, I was talking about how I was writing a lot, in high school and college, and then I went to, get an MFA, so a graduate program where I put together a book, and there's not a single story from that period that's in here, not a single one, and not because there weren't value to those stories, and not that there aren't writers who can write very evolved pieces very early, but for me, I needed to grow a lot and continue to, and I think it's important to keep that in mind, and I see, there's, stories that I've written here. Actually, the first story that I got published also won an award, which was the Great Salt Lake Desert. I had to return to that, when this was being published, and I was working with the editors from the publishing house, and that was the story that needed the most work.
What were some criticisms you received from the editors while you were writing?
Some were about inconsistencies, in, as I mentioned before, the Great Salt Lake Desert, the sort of points of view where, that story is largely from the point of view of one character named Ian. And there's a couple moments where all of a sudden, you've spent 12 pages in Ian's point of view, and then all of a sudden you see things from Cheryl's point of view. And thinking, wait a minute, that's, although when you're writing, you don't always recognize it. And that's one of them, sort of that shifting point of view. And then there are some smaller things, some larger things. Sometimes you write something and it sounds good, and you just keep going. You're like, yeah, that sounds good. And then someone calls you out on it and says, what the hell does that mean? Like, I don't know, but did you hear the way it sounds? That sounds good. And so I was grateful for, some of the feedback I received from the editors at Braddock Avenue, and they were calling me out on some of those things, and not, calling me out sounds a little harsh, but they were just asking questions about, is there a way to clarify that, or set it up a little bit better? So some of it had to do with that. And but I think that had, largely the stories, I think, were in place. There wasn't a whole lot of change. What's interesting is I've had, that process of receiving editorial feedback really varies. So, having had the opportunity to publish a variety of different stories, some journals, individual stories will have an editor who wants to work with you, just it goes over the course of days and weeks and has a lot of comments, and you just wonder, why did you accept this to begin with? Like, if you don't seem to like it. But, and actually there was a story recently that's not in this collection where an editor said, not that she hadn't accepted it. She did this kind of sneaky thing, which was that, we really like this story and we think we'd like to publish it, but would you consider changing this character in some different kinds of ways. Like what she did was identified a kind of a cliche that I had used for a particular character. And, what really annoyed me about it is that she was right. She was totally right. Yeah. And so what I did was, I just had a very honest and open communication, let her know that this story had been submitted to a couple of other places, and I wanted to get a sense of how, whether or not they were really interested in publishing it. And she wouldn't commit 100%, but her feedback was so clear that I figured, okay, I'll withdraw it from other journals because this was something that was worth doing, or I felt it was worth doing. And then there are other journals that do nothing. All of a sudden they just sort of, send you some proofs and say, this is the way it's going to look and this is where it's going to be, and are you good with that? And so that's always good. So there was a little bit of both in with every single bone in my brain. They were, Great Salt Lake Desert was an early story, and they spent a lot of time with it. I felt like they were fading out as they moved on. There were just fewer comments, or maybe that speaks to Professor Perico's comment, which is that the stories that appear later, I think, were written later. I mean, the Great Salt Lake Desert was the first story, not the first story I ever wrote, but the first story that was published. So it was an earlier story. So, so there was a lot of feedback at times, but usually about that, yeah.
What else did you find was an inspiration for your writing?
It has a lot to do, I think, with observation and, trying to wonder about certain things, trying to see how far they could go. I mean, other writers certainly inspire. I tend to get ideas for stories while listening to music. I can't write while I'm listening to music, but when I'm experiencing something, with a live musical event, for example, or just sitting around, my mind gets in a place where things just sort of happen. And sometimes it's a lot of curiosity, I think, more than anything. I'm grateful for writing in that it keeps me wondering in a lot of ways, and I think it's very easy to stop. When I get most anxious and frustrated with my day-to-day routine, it's when I'm not really wondering about things around me. It's when I'm just, so programmed. I've got to do this by then. I've got to do this other thing by then. And then I sort of lose sight of my surroundings. And so I'm grateful for those opportunities when I can kind of look around and think about why things are the way they are and investigate certain things. As I mentioned before, traveling, even in your own city, if you get a chance to go somewhere, certain things can inspire. There are some, sort of generative exercises that we do in a creative writing class, which include looking at, like a street art slideshow or something like that have these images that are just make you look at things in different ways. So I think a lot of them, and some are sort of more existential questions that, our philosopher might appreciate. Just human existence is fascinating and mysterious, and I think there are aspects of that, and it forces some unique behavior. And a lot of the stories that I write are sort of imagining people who are trying to figure out what they're supposed to do and where they're supposed to be and who they're supposed to be. Maybe too actively and aggressively, and it leads to some strange behavior. So I guess I don't know if that's too far outside of me, but it's there anyway. Observations. But thanks for the question.
What are some challenges or obstacles you face getting the emotion out in your story?
There are many, and they're ongoing, I think. A lot of times, as I mentioned before, sometimes when I figure out where a story seems to be going, I will get anxious and try to get there too quickly. And what happens then is that the character development starts to fall away, and you're just working with like a plot point. In other words, if I know that, I don't know how, I can't remember exactly how High Holy Days came together, but if I knew that the fire alarm needed to be pulled and that he was going to fall, I might have just gotten there without the patience that a story needs. And I'm not saying maybe that story did lack patience, I'm not sure, but I think that's something that I find that some of the descriptions, oftentimes we know where things are set, so we just write them, so we have the characters, they're talking, it goes from plot point to plot point to plot point, and then if you can, if you're great, fortunate enough to have a good reader, sometimes they point out, it seems like this is written in a void, like where are we exactly? And you forget, I lose sight of my setting sometimes, so I know well enough where things are taking place, but I realize that the reader doesn't always. And describing the setting in a way that moves the story forward is very challenging, I think, for me. And I often find that on revision, I have to return to stories and ground them with greater detail. And one thing that, it helps writing in general, but just thinking about sensory details. How do things look? How do things sound? How do things smell? How do things taste? What do they feel like? Whenever I remind myself that, and I have paragraphs, I know exactly where they are in different stories where I'm like, I just wrote a sensory detailed paragraph. Like okay. Actually, you can see it. There's if I can, there's a story in here called Vacancy, one of the longer stories. And there is a paragraph there. I mean, this story came together in a variety of, different ways, but at one point there is a character who winds up in a garage, and I kind of had, they were playing in the garage, they were high school kids playing in a band, and they were playing in the garage, of course. But then I had to remind myself, well, what the hell does that garage look like? Wouldn't that be important? So, and I'll just kind of here's this paragraph. Kay was buzzing as she took in this hollowed space that smelled like oil and dirt. A rusted push mower sat lifeless in the back corner. Shovels and rakes hung from nails on the walls. Amplifiers were plugged into faceless outlets, their cords resting on bags of potting soil. The microphone was wedged between a keyboard and two guitar stands in front of a drum set flanked by rows of cinder blocks and empty flower pots. There was an orange and black Doors at the Fillmore poster hanging from the back beam, and a black and white photo of Sid and Nancy scowling before a torn Sex Pistols banner pinned on a slender side shelf of tools and rusted paint cans. That was written after the fact. Honestly, it's like I'm most proud of that paragraph almost, and it was only because I had to say, this story was just characters in a place, but I hadn't brought that place to life. And I think that's one of the great challenges that I consistently face. Yeah, and I'm sure there are many others. I know there are many others. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I really am so grateful to you for everyone coming out. And again, thank you to President Schiller for putting this up, the speaker series, and everyone else who was involved. I know you weren't alone and all that stuff. And thank you again for coming, for the thoughtful questions and for your patience. Right, yeah, I knew there was some refreshment somewhere. So, there are books here. I'm happy to sell and sign them if you're interested. All right, and that's that. And if anyone has other questions outside of this, let me know. I'm happy to talk at any point.